The December wind howled across the Kentucky bluegrass like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of the season's first serious snowfall. Jake Sullivan pulled his worn leather jacket tighter as he made his final rounds of the evening, the familiar crunch of frozen grass beneath his boots, the only sound competing with nature's fury. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunset, and the weather service was predicting the worst storm in a decade. At 42, Jake had weathered enough Kentucky winters to know when to take the forecasters seriously. His calloused hands, scarred from years of ranch work, moved efficiently as he checked each stall in the main stable. The horses sensed the approaching storm. Their ears flicked nervously, and several paced restlessly in their enclosures. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured to his prize stallion, a magnificent black thoroughbred whose bloodline traced back to Secretariat. The horse's nostrils flared as Jake ran a gentle hand along his neck. "Just a little weather boy, nothing we haven't seen before." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. The ranch was hanging by a thread financially, 3 months behind on the mortgage, with the bank's final notice sitting like a time bomb on his kitchen table. The insurance settlement from the fire that had destroyed his training facility 6 months ago had barely covered the debts, leaving him scrambling to keep the remaining horses fed and sheltered. His daughter Emma, now 16 and wise beyond her years since her mother's death 4 years ago, had taken a part-time job at the local diner to help with expenses. The thought of his teenager working to save their family legacy made Jake's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and shame. This ranch had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations, and he was the one who might lose it all. The stable door creaked ominously as another gust of wind struck the building. Jake made a mental note to reinforce the hinges, another expense he couldn't afford. He was turning to head back to the house when he heard it, a soft sound that didn't belong to the storm or the horses, a quiet whimper, almost human. Jake froze, his weathered face creasing with concentration as he listened. There it was again, coming from the far end of the stable where they stored the hay bales. His hand instinctively moved to the flashlight clipped to his belt as he walked carefully toward the sound, his boots barely making a whisper on the straw-covered floor. What he found made him stop dead in his tracks. Curled up in a nest of hay bales, partially hidden beneath a tattered blanket, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the dim light from the stable's single bulb. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and even in sleep, her face bore the telltale marks of recent violence. A healing bruise along her left cheek, a cut on her lower lip that had scabbed over. Jake's first instinct was to wake her, to demand answers. This was private property, and he had Emma to think about. But something about the way she slept, one arm protectively wrapped around a small duffel bag, her body curled into a defensive position even in unconsciousness, made him pause. She was running from something, or someone. The woman stirred slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of her eyes as they fluttered open, wide green and filled with the kind of fear that spoke of genuine terror. She saw him, and immediately scrambled backward, pressing herself against the hay bales with a sharp intake of breath. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please don't call the police. I'll leave. I'm sorry, I just needed somewhere warm for the night." Jake studied her face, noting the way her hands shook and how she kept glancing toward the stable door as if calculating escape routes. Everything about her screamed abuse victim and his protective instincts, the same ones that had made him take in every stray animal that had ever wandered onto his property, kicked into overdrive. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. She hesitated, clearly debating whether to lie. "Sarah," she finally whispered. "Sarah Chen." "Well, Sarah, I'm Jake Sullivan, and this is my ranch." He gestured around the stable. "Mind telling me how you ended up sleeping with my horses?" A ghost of a smile flickered across her bruised features. "They're good company, quieter than most people, and they don't ask uncomfortable questions." Despite everything, Jake found himself almost smiling back. "Fair point, but it's going to hit below 0 tonight, and this stable isn't heated. You'll freeze to death out here." Sarah's expression hardened and she pulled her knees closer to her chest. "I've survived worse." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought of Emma, safe and warm in their house, and couldn't imagine any circumstance that would leave her sleeping in a stable in December. "I'm sure you have," he said carefully, "but you don't have to survive this. The house has a spare room, and my daughter Emma makes a mean cup of hot chocolate." Fear flashed in Sarah's eyes again. "I can't. I won't bring trouble to your family." What kind of trouble? Sarah looked away, her jaw tightening. The kind that follows women who leave when they're not supposed to. Jake felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same rage that had consumed him when Emma's mother had finally succumbed to cancer, leaving him helpless and furious at the unfairness of it all. But this anger was different, directed at the faceless person who had put those bruises on Sarah's face. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 3 days. She touched the cut on her lip unconsciously. "I had money for a bus ticket, but it only got me this far. I've been walking since yesterday." "Walking? In this weather?" Jake's voice rose slightly and Sarah flinched. He immediately softened his tone. "Sarah, you could have died out there. Maybe that would have been easier," she said so quietly he almost didn't hear her. The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Jake had heard that tone before, in his own voice during the darkest days after his wife's death. The sound of someone who had reached the end of their rope and was seriously considering letting go. "No," he said firmly. "It wouldn't have been easier." "Easier for who? For the person who hurt you? That's not how this works." Sarah's eyes snapped to his, surprise replacing some of the fear. "You don't know anything about my situation." "You're right, I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's been beaten down so far they can't see any other options. And I know that the answer isn't freezing to death in a stranger's stable." The wind chose that moment to slam against the stable with renewed fury, rattling the walls and making both of them look up at the rafters. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, visible through the gaps in the old wooden walls. "Look," Jake said, pulling off his jacket and holding it out to her. "I'm not asking you to tell me your life story. I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm just asking you to come inside before this storm kills you. Emma's making beef stew and there's enough for 3. Sarah stared at the jacket as if it might bite her. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. Do I need a reason beyond the fact that you're a human being who needs help?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked up at him, studying his weathered face as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she slowly reached out and took the jacket. "Just for tonight," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'll be gone in the morning." Jake nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of her disappearing back into the night. "Just for tonight." As Sarah struggled to her feet, Jake noticed the way she favored her left side and the careful way she moved, as if everything hurt. The protective anger flared again, but he pushed it down. Right now, she needed safety, not his rage. "The horses like you," he observed as thunder nickered softly when Sarah passed his stall. "Animals are easier to trust than people," she replied, pausing to let the stallion sniff her hand. "They don't pretend to be something they're not." Jake watched as Thunder, who was notoriously skittish around strangers, gently nuzzled Sarah's palm. In all his years of working with horses, he'd learned to trust their instincts about people. If Thunder accepted her, there was something special about this broken young woman. "Come on," he said, heading toward the stable door. "Let's get you inside before Emma sends out a search party." As they stepped into the storm, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a decision that would change everything. The snow was falling harder now, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Maybe, he thought, as he guided Sarah toward the warm glow of the farmhouse windows, that was exactly what they all needed. The warmth of the Sullivan farmhouse hit Sarah like a physical embrace as Jake guided her through the back door into the kitchen. The contrast from the bitter cold outside was so stark that she had to pause for a moment, letting her frozen fingers slowly begin to thaw. The kitchen was exactly what she'd expected from a working ranch, functional but welcoming, with worn wooden counters, copper pots hanging from hooks, and the rich aroma of beef stew simmering on an old gas stove. "Dad? That you?" A teenage girl's voice called from somewhere deeper in the house. "Yeah, and we have a guest." Emma Sullivan appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Sarah's breath caught. The girl was beautiful in that effortless way that only 16-year-olds could manage, with her father's dark hair and warm brown eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. She wore faded jeans and a Kentucky Wildcat sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that somehow looked perfectly styled. Those intelligent eyes took in Sarah's appearance in a single glance. The bruises, the torn clothes, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. But instead of the judgment or pity Sarah had braced herself for, Emma's expression softened with understanding. That was both surprising and heartbreaking in someone so young. "Hi," Emma said simply, her voice gentle. "I'm Emma. You look like you could use some of that hot chocolate Dad mentioned." Sarah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had offered her kindness without wanting something in return? I'm Sarah, and hot chocolate sounds really good. Excellent choice. Dad makes terrible hot chocolate, but I've perfected the recipe. Emma moved to the stove with practiced efficiency, pulling mugs from the cabinet and reaching for a container of cocoa powder. Dad, she needs dry clothes. Mom's things are still in the guest room closet. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of his late wife, but he nodded. Good thinking. Sarah, why don't you get cleaned up and changed? The guest room is just down the hall, second door on the right. There's a bathroom attached. Sarah hesitated, her hand gripping the strap of her duffel bag. The offer of a hot shower and clean clothes was almost too good to be true, but accepting felt like admitting she was staying. And staying meant getting comfortable, and getting comfortable meant letting her guard down. It's okay, Emma said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. The door has a lock and we're not going anywhere. Take your time. The simple acknowledgement of her need for security, the understanding that she might need to feel safe behind a locked door, nearly brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She managed a shaky nod and followed Jake's directions down the hallway. The guest room was small but cozy, with a handmade quilt covering a double bed and family photos scattered across the dresser. Sarah caught glimpses of a beautiful woman with Emma's smile in several of the pictures. Jake's late wife, she realized. The attached bathroom was clean and functional, with thick towels hanging from hooks and toiletries arranged neatly on the counter. Sarah locked the door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to truly breathe for the first time in days. The mirror above the sink reflected a stranger back at her, hollow-eyed and gaunt, with bruises in various stages of healing, painting a roadmap of violence across her face and neck. She touched the worst of them, a purple and yellow constellation along her left cheekbone, and felt the familiar mixture of shame and rage that had become her constant companion. He did this to you, she reminded herself, and you got away. The hot water of the shower felt like a miracle against her skin. She stood under the spray longer than she should have, letting the heat work its way into muscles that had been tense for so long she'd forgotten what relaxation felt like. When she finally emerged, she found clothes laid out on the bed, jeans that looked like they'd fit, a soft blue sweater, and undergarments that were clearly new, tags still attached. Emma had been shopping, Sarah realized. The girl had somehow managed to guess her size and had clearly made a trip to town while Sarah was showering. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the understanding that she would need underwear and basic necessities, brought tears to her eyes that she quickly wiped away. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Jake and Emma engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered. Emma was stirring the hot chocolate, while Jake ladled stew into bowls, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, though she was already calculating the distance to the back door. "Fine," Jake said, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just discussing the weather. Storm's getting worse. Roads are already impassable." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. If the roads were blocked, she was trapped here, and if Marcus somehow managed to track her down... "Hey," Emma said, appearing at her elbow with a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. "You went somewhere scary just then. Want to talk about it?" The directness of the question, delivered without judgment, caught Sarah off guard. She accepted the mug gratefully, using it to warm her hands while she considered her answer. "I'm not used to being trapped anywhere," she finally said. "You're not trapped," Jake said firmly. "You're safe. There's a difference." Sarah wanted to believe him, but 4 years with Marcus had taught her that safety was an illusion, and sanctuary could become a prison faster than most people could imagine. They ate dinner in relative quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence Sarah had expected. Instead, it felt companionable, like a family sharing a meal on a snowy evening. The stew was incredible, rich and hearty, with tender beef and vegetables that had clearly been simmered for hours. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd had a home-cooked meal that wasn't accompanied by criticism or threats. "This is amazing," she said, and meant it. "Emma's recipe," Jake said proudly. "She's been doing most of the cooking since..." He trailed off, glancing at his daughter. "Since Mom died," Emma finished matter-of-factly. "Dad burns water, so it was either learn to cook or starve." "I do not burn water," Jake protested, but his eyes were warm with affection. "You burned soup, Dad. Soup from a can." Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. There was something healing about witnessing this easy affection between father and daughter, this glimpse of what a healthy relationship looked like. "What about you, Sarah?" Emma asked. "Do you cook?" "I used to." Sarah's voice grew quiet. I wasn't allowed to anymore. He said I always did it wrong. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Jake's knuckles were white where he gripped his spoon, and Emma's young face was tight with anger. Well, that's complete bullshit, Emma said firmly, earning a sharp look from her father. Sorry, Dad, but it is. I bet you're a great cook. Emma's right, Jake said, his voice carefully controlled. About the cooking, I mean, though we might work on the language. Despite everything, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up in her chest. You remind me of my sister, she told Emma. She never could keep her opinions to herself either. Where is she now? Emma asked. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. I don't know, she whispered. I haven't been able to contact her in 2 years. He wouldn't let me. Jake's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. I need to check on the horses, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Make sure they're settled for the night. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, and Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. Did I say something wrong? No, Emma said quickly. Dad he gets really upset when people hurt women. Mum's death wasn't anyone's fault, but I think he feels like he failed to protect her somehow. When he hears about guys like whoever hurt you, it brings all that back. Sarah stared at the door Jake had disappeared through. I should go. I'm bringing problems into your house. Sarah, look at me. Emma's voice was firm, older than her years. You're not bringing problems. You are a problem that someone else created, and there's a difference. Dad knows that. He's just processing. You're very wise for 16. Emma's smile was sad. You grow up fast when your mum dies, and your dad is struggling to keep everything together. I've been watching him try to save this ranch for months, working himself to death because he thinks he has to do it all alone. Sound familiar? The parallel hit home and Sarah felt her chest tighten. How do you know so much about this? Because half the women in this county have been where you are. Mrs. Henderson down the road, Maria who works at the grocery store, even our pastor's daughter last year. Small towns see everything and we take care of our own. I'm not one of your own. You are now, Emma said simply. The moment Dad brought you in from that stable, you became family. That's how it works here. Sarah felt tears threaten again. I can't stay. It's not safe for you. Then we'll make it safe. Emma's voice held a determination that reminded Sarah achingly of herself at that age, before the world had taught her that determination wasn't always enough. But first, you need to heal. And that takes time. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows and driving snow against the glass. Sarah looked out at the storm and realized that even if she wanted to leave, she couldn't. The weather had made the decision for her. Just until the storm passes, she said, more to herself than to Emma. Just until the storm passes, Emma agreed, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was talking about more than just the weather. When Jake returned 20 minutes later, stomping snow off his boots and hanging his coat by the door, he found Sarah and Emma washing dishes together at the sink. The sight of them, his daughter laughing at something Sarah had said, Sarah's face more relaxed than it had been since he'd found her, made something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Horses are settled, he announced. Storm's supposed to last through tomorrow night at least. Sarah nodded, not meeting his eyes. I understand. Good. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. That gives us time to figure out our next steps. Our next steps? Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. Well, Jake said, his tone casual, Emma mentioned you have a way with horses. Thunder hasn't let a stranger touch him in years, but he took to you right away. And we could use some help around here, especially with the training program we're trying to get off the ground. Sarah stared at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance to earn your keep while you figure out what comes next. Room and board, plus a small salary. Nothing fancy, but honest work. Dad, Emma said quietly, tell her about the ranch. Jake shot his daughter a look, but she met it steadily. After a moment, he sighed. We're in trouble, Sarah. The ranch, I mean. We're behind on the mortgage, and if we can't find a way to bring in more income soon, we're going to lose everything. My family's had this land for 3 generations, and I'll be the one who lost it. The vulnerability in his admission made Sarah's heart ache. Here was a man who had taken her in without question, offering her safety and employment, and he was the one who needed help. What kind of training program? She asked quietly. Jake's eyes lit up with the first real hope she'd seen from him. Therapeutic riding. There's a demand for it, especially for kids with disabilities and trauma survivors. We have the horses, the land, and the facilities. We just need someone who understands both horses and healing. Sarah looked between Jake and Emma, seeing the desperate hope in both their faces. She thought about the peace she'd felt in the stable, the way Thunder had accepted her touch, the feeling of belonging she'd experienced for the first time in years. "I don't have any official training," she said slowly. "Neither do we," Emma said with a grin. "We'll figure it out together." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the warm kitchen, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future that didn't involve running. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll try." 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and Sarah was beginning to understand why the Sullivan Ranch had captured the hearts of 3 generations. The rolling hills stretched endlessly under the January sky, painted in shades of brown and gold that changed with the light. The morning frost created a crystalline wonderland that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical, and Sarah found herself looking forward to her early morning walks to the stable. Her routine had become as natural as breathing. Up before dawn, coffee with Jake in the quiet kitchen while Emma got ready for school, then out to feed the horses and begin the day's training sessions. The work was physically demanding. Her muscles ached in ways they hadn't since her college days, but it was also healing in ways she hadn't expected. The horses had accepted her completely. Thunder, Jake's temperamental stallion, had become her shadow, following her around the paddock and nickering softly whenever she approached his stall. Bella, a gentle mare with soulful brown eyes, seemed to sense Sarah's emotional state and would rest her massive head against Sarah's shoulder whenever the memories became too overwhelming. "You're a natural," Jake had told her just that morning as they watched her work with Moonbeam, a young gelding they were training for the therapeutic riding program. "I've never seen horses respond to someone the way they respond to you." The compliment had warmed her more than she cared to admit. It had been so long since someone had praised her abilities rather than criticized her failures that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be good at something. The therapeutic riding program was slowly taking shape. Sarah had spent hours researching online, reading about equine-assisted therapy and the profound impact it could have on trauma survivors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was designing a program to help heal others while she was still piecing herself back together. "Sarah, you need to see this," Emma called from the barn office, excitement clear in her voice. Sarah finished brushing Moonbeam and made her way to the small office Jake had set up in the converted tack room. Emma was seated at the ancient computer, practically bouncing in her chair as she pointed at the screen. "Look at this email. It's from the Fayette County Social Services. They want to schedule a visit to discuss referring clients to our program." Sarah leaned over Emma's shoulder to read the message. Her heart began to race as she took in the official letterhead and formal language. "They want to do a site inspection and interview process. That's huge." "It's more than huge," Jake said from the doorway, his face split by the biggest grin Sarah had seen from him. "If we get county approval, we'll have a steady stream of referrals. It could save the ranch." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a blanket. She'd known the ranch was in financial trouble, but seeing the hope in Jake's eyes made her realize just how much this meant to the Sullivan family legacy. "When is the visit scheduled?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Next Friday," Emma replied. "That gives us a week to get everything perfect." A week. Sarah felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. In her experience, inspections meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant the possibility of discovery. What if they ran background checks? What if they asked questions she couldn't answer? What if Marcus had somehow tracked her here? "Sarah," Jake's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You went somewhere else again." She looked up to find both Jake and Emma watching her with concern. Over the past 3 weeks, they'd learned to recognize the signs when her past tried to drag her back into darkness. "I'm just worried about the inspection," she said, which was true if incomplete. "We'll be fine," Jake said firmly. "So you know these horses better than anyone, and you understand trauma recovery in ways most people can't. That's exactly what they're looking for." Sarah nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. She excused herself and walked back to the paddock, needing the calming presence of the horses to settle her nerves. Thunder was waiting for her, as if he sensed her distress. She leaned against the fence and he immediately approached, pressing his massive head against her chest in a gesture of comfort that never failed to amaze her. "You always know, don't you, boy?" she murmured, running her fingers through his mane. "I wish I had your confidence." "He trusts you completely." Sarah turned to find Jake approaching, his expression thoughtful. He'd changed out of his work clothes and was wearing the clean jeans and button-down shirt he reserved for trips to town or important phone calls. "Animals are easier to trust than people," Sarah said, echoing her words from that first night. "Is that why you're scared of the inspection? Because it means trusting people?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder's gentle breathing. I'm scared they'll ask questions I can't answer. I'm scared they'll want references or background checks or, I don't know, official things. Jake leaned against the fence beside her. What kind of questions?